little penises in plants, but you know, but there's no evidence that plants. He couldn't see at the microscopic level. He certainly couldn't see at the molecular level that fungi and animals were related, plants and fungi, plants and animals, and he was stymied at that level. Doesn't mean he didn't make a strong case for evolution, but he couldn't carry it as far as you can with the molecular data. So now we know. So these are all vertebrates up here. Here's insects, silk moth and whatever. Here's fungi. This is yeast, bread mold, and another related fungi. They're related to the animals. Here are the plants, okay, and they're also related to the animals. They all join at one point here. We now know that probably you're more closely related to a mushroom than you are to a dandelion. I don't know if that gives you any comfort or not, but we now know that to be true. Not only that, but we're related to bacteria. So this kind of molecular phylogeny, molecular evidence shows that we are related to bacteria. Not only that, most of these changes are taking place in a stochastic manner, a probabilistic manner. And you think, okay, so it's all chance and accident. Yeah, but one of the nice things about probability is that you can make calculations if you have big enough numbers, right? So you know that if you flip a coin 1,000 times, you're going to get about 500 heads and 500 tails. And they vary by a little bit, but you know roughly what's going to happen. Same with these molecular changes, since they are occurring stochastically by random genetic drift. That means that they are fairly regular over long periods of time. That's why all these branches mostly reach to the same level, okay? The same amount of changes. So if you know the amount of changes occurring per year, which you can determine by having a few key markers from the fossil record, then you can actually make predictions. So when did plants diverge from animals and fungi? You can count up the number of variants and the number of differences, and you arrive at a number of roughly 1 billion years ago. And then, of course, you look in the fossil record, and what evidence we do have is quite consistent with that. You go back even further, when did organisms such as ourselves and another organism that contain nuclei called eukaryotes, when did they diverge from bacteria? That's this point. That's about 2 billion years ago. Because we have a kind of molecular clock that will tell us all these things. Darwin knew nothing of that. He would have been delighted. Okay? It's fabulous. It's totally independent confirmation of evolution. It's totally independent confirmation of evolution by genetic changes. It's not confirmation of natural selection, because this is probably not natural selection that's happening here. This is random genetic drift instead of selection. But we have other data that says that natural selection is very powerful and very potent. You can construct enormous, elaborate trees of life using molecular data. Here's all the blue things are bacteria. Here's us, way up here. Just this little red group up here are animals. This little group here, this is animals. But Darwin wouldn't have known that. He was thinking animals and plants are just about everything. Right? Now we know that we're actually a very small part of life, and related only late. We're late comers to evolution, and the deep relationships are all bacterial. Here's a cover of New Scientist from last week. Darwin was wrong. Now, their article is wrong, but it does bring up a point. Darwin was wrong about some things, and it shouldn't come as a surprise. It was, after all, 150 years ago, and there's lots of things he didn't know. He was wrong about genetics. Not only did he not know about genetics, but he had some ideas about genetics, but they were all wrong. He was wrong about the causes of variation. It's not caused by use and disuse. It's caused by spontaneous chemical changes, or what we now call mutations. Okay, so he didn't know that. He was probably wrong about speciation, about what causes speciation. Now we think that it's a little more complicated. It's not all just due to natural selection. There are other things going on. So he didn't quite get that right, but he certainly was well ahead of his time in promoting the idea that things do speciate. He was probably wrong about his emphasis on natural selection. We now know that some things happen not by selection but by accident, or what's called drift, or random genetic drift. So the emphasis was probably wrong. He was not as correct as he could have been about the rates at which things change. He thought things always change slowly and gradually. We now know quite a few examples of things that change in relatively quickly and then remain stable for some time. So that's a controversial part of modern evolutionary theory. So he was wrong about quite a few things, but he got the important part right. He got right the idea that special creation is no longer a viable hypothesis, that life has evolved. Here is the evidence for evolution. He got right the idea that natural selection is an important mechanism of evolution that causes change and explains how change happens. And that's why, within a period of 10 years, from publication of Origin of Species, he had basically convinced all of the intellectual society, all of the people who were the thinkers and the shakers and the movers in society, converted, if you will, to an acceptance of a natural evolution and not special creation. And this did happen. Now, there was a little bit of backsliding in the early part of the 20th century, but he really did a really phenomenal job. As one of my colleagues, who's a philosopher, said, it's about the closest thing you'll ever get to a paradigm shift. He's not a big fan of paradigm shifts. He's a very much overused word. But if there is one example, this is it. This is in a very short period of time, people went from natural theology to natural selection, to evolution. That's why we celebrate Charles Darwin as the greatest, one of the greatest scientists that the world has ever seen. And that's why we wish him happy birthday on a day like this. Thank you very much.
We have time for a few questions. We'll get you, I guess just scream it out since the other mic isn't working. Do you want to take it?
I'll repeat the question. Yeah.
They would never publish a magazine that said Newton was wrong. But aside from that, chapter 6 of the Origin, the one where he had problems with the theory,
yes,
that's given the creationists and the intelligent designers just about all the ammunition they've needed for the last few hundred years, the last 100 years anyway, because they go through the ideas, lack of transitional forms, the idea of irreducibility, the eye could not have just come.
Yes, and they pick up phrases where Darwin said, you know, if anyone could ever show that some complex organism could not possibly have been formed by natural selection, then my theory will fall apart.
Yes.
And the creationists just, yeah, I got one, oh, I got one, and, you know. And what they do is they give us examples where we don't know the answer yet. Okay? But they say, see, you can't explain it. Okay? Therefore, God exists.
I heard recently that Darwin.
No.
I'm sorry.
I have a question up here first. Okay.
Just talk about religion briefly. My understanding was that Darwin came from a pretty religious background. He studied theology. His wife, I understood, was quite religious. And is it sort of a two-part question? Is it true that he delayed the publication because it was so controversial, or would have been so controversial, that he couldn't have dealt with the churches and his family's reaction to that? And the other question is did he believe in God, and did his research about evolution change his belief in God? So,
a lot of questions there. First of all, Erasmus Darwin, his grandfather, was an atheist, so they didn't use the word. He did not believe in God. Robert Darwin, his father, did not believe in God and told everybody that. The Wedgwood family, Sarah Wedgwood, his mother, were Unitarians. If you know anything about Unitarians,